Hello, thank you so much for coming today. I've been very much looking forward to this session. I wanted to tell you a little bit about how I came to know of Sharon's work. So Dr. Sharon Blackie is the author of 5 books of fiction and nonfiction, including the best-selling If Women Rose Rooted and The Enchanted Life and Haggitude and others, all of which I recommend. So Sharon earned a PhD in behavioral neuroscience. She has a diploma in clinical hypnotherapy and degrees in creative writing and Celtic studies. She is a beautiful example of a mixture of academic rigor and creative magic. And as I said, when I was a child, I was really saved by my imaginal world, which is something Sharon speaks and writes quite a bit about. My imagination enabled me to walk through scenes of chaos and confusion when I was a child. And I know my mom is actually on today, so she also had a similar experience when she was younger. As I grew older, I tried to engage fully in the world of adults. But then about 6 years ago, my concern about the state of the world had just grown too great for me to manage myself. And I needed to find a way to compost my own grief and anxiety about the world, especially about our ecological crises, into something productive and regenerative. So I was seeking a process of metamorphosis, and I found the ideal pathway charted by Dr. Blackie's work. She had created experiences in which the agent of transformation was my own imagination. And that was really, really powerful for me to kind of come into the world in a new way. So when I came to the Garrison Institute and learned that its 20th anniversary would be celebrated through an exploration of metamorphosis, and this will happen on November 9th in New York City at Rockefeller University, to which all of you are invited. And Fru will put the link in the chat. I immediately thought of Sharon and all that she has offered to the world. So her deep scholarship, as I said, and academic rigor, her real world experience in Jungian psychology, dream work, cultivating the active imagination, and not to mention a treasure trove of myths and stories and folk tales and fairy tales that she can bring into her work from many parts of the world. So just a few of the perspective shifts that I've learned from her work are how we can expand beyond our anthropocentric worldview to realize and fully engage with the many, many allies that we actually have, the value of developing a reciprocal relationship with our places, how to listen for the land's dreaming, which Sharon may explain, and then how to investigate our own indigeneity. So something we all do have inside us, even if we have to reach back into millennia. So these are all incredibly valuable capacities to carry us into a world that is undergoing a profound metamorphosis. And we are interested in exploring this theme, as I said, through this session and through our anniversary event on November 9th. But now I want to turn the session over to Sharon so she can share some thoughts about how the concept of metamorphosis shows up today and in the old stories.
Sharon, thank you so much for the invitation and for that wonderful introduction. It's lovely to be able to work with you in a different kind of setting. Before I get onto the whole issue of metamorphosis and transformation, I just wanted to say that every now and again at this time of day, and as a consequence of some treatment for an illness I had about 3 years ago, I get a bit of a tickle in my throat. If that happens, I will mute myself, cough, drink a glass of water, and then everything will be fine. If you see me do that, I'm not going to keel over. It's just perfectly normal for me at this time, but every now and again it happens. Transformation, shape-shifting, metamorphosis, these are all things that have captured my imagination in the form of fairy tales and mythology ever since I was a very, very small child. And I have worked with, apart from reading fairy tales and myths since I was very, very tiny, I've worked with them in professional settings as a psychologist, as a teacher, as a writer for certainly the past couple of decades and probably a little bit more. So the stories from our European traditions about shape-shifting creatures really have informed a lot of the ways that I think about the world and about my place in it. So that's what I want to talk about for a little while before we get into a wider conversation. In the folk and fairy tales, particularly of Europe and in our mythology, shape-shifting is a natural act. It's particularly associated with women. So with a bit of apology to the men who are on this call, I'm going to focus a little bit more on women shape-shifting as opposed to men. And we can talk about some of the reasons for that. But shape-shifting from animal form to human form is a perfectly natural process. We have goddesses, and occasionally gods, but mostly goddesses, who transfer from a human form to a crow form, to a deer form, to a swan form, all kinds of different forms. And the human form that they take is not superior to the animal form that they take. There is no value judgment. It's just a simple shifting of being and way of being in the world. In folklore and in fairy tales, there are vast numbers of stories about both men and women who take animal form, but often for different reasons. And that's what I want to explore just a little bit. My favorite story, and the one that captured my imagination, I think, very early on, is a story that occurs again and again in Scotland, in Ireland, in Scandinavia, the Faroe Isles, all that kind of western seaboard of Europe, the kind of wild fringes of Europe. And it is a story about a seal who has the ability to, every month at the time of the full moon, shake off its seal skin and transform into a human. Then they're women as well as men, but the more interesting stories, I think, if you'll forgive me, are about the women. So the women, the seal women, under the light of the full moon, shed their seal skins, dance on a beach under the moonlight. And the common story that's told again and again and again is that a fisherman, a young fisherman, sees them dancing on the beach, thinks they're very, very beautiful, decides he would like to have one for his wife, steals her skin away, and all of her sisters disappear back into the sea, but she can't because she hasn't got a skin, and he basically tells her that she is going to need to stay with him for 7 years as his wife, probably bear him children, and then if she's lucky, she'll get the skin back and she can go back to the sea. Of course, that doesn't happen. In any of those stories, he never gives her her skin back. It is found for her normally by a child, normally a daughter, and then at that point, she slips back into the sea, leaves her family behind because she is back in her natural element. And the reason why that is so important to her is over the course of the 7 years, she has been beginning to dry up. She has been on the verge of death. She is out of her natural element and she doesn't know how to be. She can't survive that way. So, I've never really told that story, particularly to a group of women who haven't resonated with that in so many ways, because who has not at this time of our civilization felt as if her skin hasn't been stolen somewhere along the way? Who hasn't felt as if we've been kind of exiled or banished from our natural element, that wild, creaturely side of us, in order to satisfy an excess of civilization and domestication? So these stories of women who lose their skins and get them back, the animal side of the nature, the wild woman archetype, if you like, inside of them, are stories really of yearning for a part of ourselves that we feel that we have lost, or maybe a part that we feel we might once have had but never properly knew. And that part of ourselves is the kind of instinctive, slightly wild, animal, body-centered knowing that we're not encouraged in this culture to employ. What we're encouraged to employ is the rational, intellectual side of ourselves. And both are important, but if we lose one, then we're not whole. We're not in balance. We're not whole. There are other stories of shape-shifting women who are more ambiguous creatures, animal brides, if you like. That's how they're normally talked about in folklore, who are very much more ambiguous creatures. So we find in Sweden, for example, there's a forest-dwelling fox-like huldra, basically a woman who, if you catch her on the side, has a foxtail. And they tend to be beautiful, dangerous beings who slowly drain the life energy from their human lovers. sometimes these stories remind us that to be wild is not always to be benign, that you have to be very careful. And also, it's not to be exploited, because if you do, there are often very negative consequences, and it might just exploit you in turn. And this aspect of our native folklore actually always reassures me, because it seems real, that there are consequences for bad behavior, that if you're not careful, if you think you're out there to exploit, something might just come back and hit you in the face. And it does reflect a world, I think, in which that shadow element is very real. And yet in the world today, we don't seem able to cope with it. We're very capable of coping with the light side of it, but we're not quite so capable of dealing with the kind of consequential, darker side of it. In many of the old shape-shifting tales of this nature, the husband is representing or symbolizing the human world, while his animal wife represents the natural world. And the persistence of these stories into modern times, it seems to me, can be seen as a kind of reflection of our longing to reestablish a lost relationship with the natural world. That's what these stories are telling us, that there is a wildness inside us that has to be acknowledged. And if it's not acknowledged, something essential is taken away from us. The oldest recorded animal bride tales include, in this part of the world, particularly in Britain and in Ireland, a series of kind of ancestral myths, such as in relation to the Selkie story that I just spoke about, the Scottish Island stories of families who say that they are descended from Selkies and produce webbed fingers and sometimes webbed feet to prove it. That sense of families who claim their descent from the marriage of humans and shape-shifting animals is really quite a strong one in very, very many cultures. And back in the day, in the earlier stories, these interrelationships between the animal and human were not seen as in any way evil or immoral. It was seen as a reflection of the ability of people to change form. In our oldest stories, the body is an unstable site. It shifts. It's natural for it to shift. There isn't this sense of the confined and defined and, you may not leave, and the boundaries that we think of now in our physical world. So these early traditions where shape-shifting is a natural thing and isn't judged. I mean, sometimes it has negative consequences if you marry a shapeshifter, but it isn't judged as evil. Those traditions really do seem to reflect a much more pre-Enlightenment view, one in which humans were seen to be an intrinsic part of the natural world and were related to the animals. And this was natural and normal, rather than this sense that we have post the Enlightenment that we're separate from nature and that we possess dominion over all of the other creatures in it because we imagine ourselves to be so very superior. But the early stories have that sense of natural equality threaded through them. But you can trace some of these stories through the centuries, and what you find is that later animal bride stories are much more likely to end badly. And perhaps that just arises from a worldview which very much now perceives humanity and kind of civilizations as distinct from and superior to nature and the wilderness. And so the suggestion is that humans and their animal lovers come from decidedly separate worlds, and you mustn't ever combine the two, otherwise it's doomed to failure. It's really interesting that stories of animal brides portray their animal and human natures as inextricably intertwined. Like the Selkie story tells us that you can't take half of it away and leave a wholeness behind. They're both animal and human at the same time. And this sits, interestingly, for the men in the group, this sits in stark contrast to stories in which it is an animal bridegroom rather than a bride. So where it is the male character in the story who takes on animal form. In those stories, interestingly, it's almost always portrayed as a punishment. So there's a couple of very, very well-known stories. I think the one that most people recognize is East of the Moon, West of the Sun, where the male protagonist, a prince, of course, has been transformed into a bear because of a spell that's been put on him by a wicked woman that he refused to marry. And the woman in the story saves him from his animal self, and he is transformed back into a human being, and there goes the bear. That's the end of that. So we have this really strange situation in which, if it's a female that is transforming from animal form, that's okay, that's natural. But if it's a man that's transforming, that's a terrible thing, and he must be saved from it. I wrote a book, I don't know how many years ago now, 3-4 years ago, a book of short stories which were reimagined fairy tales about shape-shifting women. So I took the original stories and I kind of produced the voices of the characters for today. So if those characters came today, how would they sound? What would they say? How would their stories be different? And I used those animal transformation motifs to explore the qualities that might be at the heart of what I think of as women's creative power today. Because those stories really are not just about the ability to transform ourselves in times of crisis, but about the ways in which our innate association with the wild and our kinship with nature is reflected in a time of environmental crisis. Because it seems to me today, when we look at a world which has so very successfully divorced itself from the natural world and thinks itself as other to it, and that in the world today where that has happened, that we need these stories more than ever, because even when they don't always end well, these old stories tell us that once upon a time, in the lands of my ancestry, which is pretty much throughout Europe, we saw the world differently. When we're looking at a kind of overturning of many, many aspects of traditional social order, can these stories tell us anything? Can they help us to kind of renegotiate and reimagine our fractured relationship with the natural world today? I mean, certainly for me, they reflect my longing for a wilderness that now is very far removed from our daily lives. For most of us, I live in a very remote place here in England where you stand at the top of a hill and wherever you look, there are no big cities. But nevertheless, we don't have that wildness in the same way that our ancestors did. They only really live on in our imagination. But I think that these shape-shifting beings, these shape-shifting stories, represent a rich and a really necessary wildness that our civilization has all but wiped out. But if we know these stories, if we find these stories, we have the sense and the confidence, I suppose, that that ability to really connect with the natural world, that ability to feel a genuine kinship with the natural world and with the other than humans that inhabit it with us, is in our ancestry. It is in our lineage. And it hasn't been lost for very long. If you look at the whole history of humans in the world, we have lost that for a very, very tiny proportion of it, mostly since the Enlightenment, which was only, 200-300 years ago. So it seems to me that these old stories can teach us how to be in the world, and they have something that anchors us in our own cultures and the past of our own cultures, which was very much more cognizant of the animate world around us. In our old stories, everything in the world was animate, not just other animals, but everything. A tree, a rock, everything had a story to tell if you happened to cross it and took the time to listen. And so to me, these old stories really are important. At the heart of every fairy tale, every single fairy tale, I defy you to find me one that where this isn't true. At the heart of every single fairy tale is transformation. They help us to reimagine ourselves. They take us from the beginning of the story where everything is impossible. The world is about to end for the hero or the heroine. And little by little, and in the case of the heroines, more so than the heroes, interestingly, in the case of the heroines, it can only ever be accomplished with the help of an animal, a little mouse or a crow, or a wise old woman in the woods. By the end of it, everything is transformed. So what seemed to be impossible at the beginning is all of a sudden now possible, almost always through the help of creatures and beings that are part of the natural world around us. So fairy tales of this kind, particularly when they include shape-shifting creatures tell us that there is very much more to life than we can ever possibly know, and that we probably today imagine. And it seems to me that they reveal to us kind of glimpses of the mysteries which lie behind the particular aspects of the physical world that we choose to focus on. Stories about shapeshifters, about that very fluid relationship between human and animal, between civilized and wild, help us to come to see that there are other ways of imagining the world and imagining our place in it, and show us that it is entirely possible, even today, especially today, to live more intensely and more richly in a multi-layered and very animate world. As well as teaching us that, some of these stories that show us it doesn't always work out well when a kind of animal bride or an animal bridegroom marries a human, they also tell us that although, we should respect and honor the other than human creatures who inhabit it alongside us, they also teach us about how difficult it can be to hold that balance between kinship and otherness. And the best stories, I think, honor both of that. That yes, we are kin with the animal world around us, but we are also different, and some things don't always mix. But the very, very best stories, I think, for me, are the ones where they teach us that animals have a wisdom that we as humans do not. And it's not very profound if you think about it. I mean, clearly, animals have different ways of sensing, they have different ways of knowing, they have different ways of being in the world. And every now and again, we need access to that wisdom because ours is limited. There are some wonderful old stories, particularly in the British Welsh traditions, especially, where somebody setting out on a quest is looking for the answer to a question and goes to a village to ask the people in the village, do they know the answer to this question? And they don't. They say, but go to the oldest people who are in a hut, they're not out in the streets. Go to them and ask them. And the oldest people don't know. So they say, go to the animals and perhaps they know. And the animals don't know, but the oldest animal always knows. And there is this sense of a kind of hierarchy of knowledge, frankly, because the animals in this worldview were here before us, have different ways of perceiving that we think with all of our cleverness, that we are better than them, but actually they are often the ones who know where a particular thing can be found in the world, the eagle particularly, who is always kind of flying over and looking down and seeing things. So this sense of respect for animals, acknowledging all of their strangeness, as well as their familiarity to us, the complexity of that really, really captures my imagination and makes me believe that there is wisdom in these stories for today that we can still mine. But what is important above all, and then I'll finish, Karen, and we can perhaps have a chat about it, is that even all of those stories, pretty much all of those stories, whatever else they might teach us, whatever else they might tell us, they make it very clear that our ancestors believed that the borderlines between humans and other animals were much, much less clearly defined than we believe them to be today, and very much more easily bridged. And they come from a time where the sacred was not in a building. The sacred was everywhere. There was no secular. Everything was animate. Everything had soul. And therefore, you didn't need a special intermediary. You didn't need a special building. It was right there, all around you, in that tree or that stone or that fish. And animals were very much more than creatures that we just could hunt and could eat. They were teachers and allies, and sometimes they were even gods. And I think that's a really good thing for us to remember today in a world where so many humans seem to believe that we are the gods. We are the ones that know everything. They really do take us right back to basics, right back to the whole question of who we are, what is our place on this planet, what are we for?
Oh, beautiful. Thank you so much. There's so much inspiration and richness in everything you've shared. So I have a few questions, and I also want to let everyone know that you'll if you'll put your questions in the Q&A. I know there are a couple in the chat in the Q&A. I'm gonna weave those in as well. But I wanted to start with, this notion of how we used to, it was so much easier for us in the past to be able to listen to the earth, listen to our allies in the natural world, and that especially for the Western mind. And I've been in a number of meetings just recently, kind of watching a lot of human beings just kind of squawking at each other and working ourselves into a frenzy around the crises that we are, the multiple crises that we're observing and perhaps being engaged in. And so the idea of actually being able to be an audience for the earth, or be an audience for the animals and listen, is, I think, a pretty foreign practice for many of us. But it's so much of your work, I think, helps people to begin to reinvigorate that practice. I just wanted to ask you about what have you found to be some of those practices that really anchor your ability to listen in and be able to interpret these stories and live these stories in a way that reflects an older worldview?
Yeah, I mean, for me, that started when a few years ago now, well, no, over a decade ago, I moved to a very, very remote part of this part of the world, the Outer Hebrides. I moved to the Isle of Lewis in the Outer Hebrides, and we lived on the western coast, the far western coast of the Isle of Lewis, looking out effectively to America. And there were very, very few people there. I had no one to talk to. And so I began to look at the folk stories that were in that place, and found a very wonderful old woman who is very important in Scottish and Irish literature, called the Cailleach, which literally means old woman. She is the old woman who creates and shapes the land. And there were various places in our kind of township that were named after this wonderful old mythological creature, who is still very much alive in that part of the world today. I had no humans to talk to, so I just talked to her in those places. I thought, gosh, I've got to talk to somebody. And that really, that sense of just that there was something or someone there to talk to, changed everything. Something as simple as that, because I figured that if I was talking to this Cailleach energy in the land, maybe it was talking back to me. And I started to kind of listen and look for clues. And to cut a very long story short, it has got to the stage where, having started to do that probably around 2010, I think it would have been, I can't go out today without talking to things. And it's not a kind of affectation. It's just natural. If I see a crow, it's hello crow. If I see the apple tree has got a particularly beautiful apple on it, then I talk to the apple tree and tell it how wonderful it is and how much pleasure it's giving us. And that seems to me, having spent a lot of time in very remote places where there were only other than humans to talk to, that seems to me perfectly natural. It's as if I would kind of meet a neighbor on the street. So I wouldn't kind of ignore him. I would talk to him. That, I think, just acting as if the tree or the rock or the bird is able to be in a relationship with you makes it so. Acting as if is a really interesting psychological tool that is used in various different ways. But certainly for that, it's just like you just get into a habit, and then you start to look for the crow behaving differently, or, kind of sitting on a branch and looking at you. And that whole sense of being in relationship. The second thing is to stop feeling that this is a boundary, that this body, that our skin is a boundary. And that there's a trick to this, which I wrote about in my book, The Enchanted Life. And it's a trick that worked for me. And it was that sense of, I remember walking through a wood one day and smelling the bluebells. And all of a sudden, it was as if something had shifted in me, so that I thought, well, that's really interesting. There are the bluebells. There am I. But what's this thing in me that's bluebell? What's that scent? So the bluebell is kind of entering into me through my nose, through my eyes when I actually look at it. And that sense of being kind of then permeated by the bluebell, all of a sudden there just wasn't quite so much separation. And I remember reading a phenomenologist, a philosopher who studied phenomenology once upon a time, and he said, okay, you think that you're touching the mantelpiece in your room, but what if the mantelpiece is touching you? And again, that shift of perspective, I think, is something that each of us can at least play with. We can practice, we can test, we can see if it works for us. But that shift of perception, I really do believe, is all it takes to connect us back to the natural world in the way that our ancestors did. I don't think there is any great trick. You don't have to go on a course. You don't even have to buy a book. You just have to kind of look at the world as if it were alive and capable of being in a relationship with you. And then all of a sudden you are.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I think one more, and then I'm gonna start bringing in the audience questions. So you were just speaking about, I think, these more subtle, smaller, everyday practices that we can start immediately. And then there's this maybe bigger process of transformation or metamorphosis. And I know in your life, because you've written about these events when you decided to become a pilot, to sort of this, it sounded like a pretty bold act. You had a fear of flying and you decided to learn how to fly and perhaps initiate a sort of metamorphosis in your own life. And then most recently, I know you had an illness that you've also talked about, and it sounded to me like a little more of a retreat, a quieter time of change or transformation from what I've gleaned. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about, those two different forms of transformation. One that sounds sort of, both maybe with courage, but one sounds a little more external and one more internal, if that makes sense.
Yeah, do you know, it's interesting. Listening to that question, I don't think I see it that way. To me, every transformation involves a little death. So, you're shedding something, you're shedding a skin in order for a new skin to form. That skin is dying. The old self is dying so that something new can happen again and again and again. When I was younger, I wasn't going to let that happen. It was partly a function of my childhood. I was not going to have anything that I was clinging to die. No, that was not going to happen. And when I got to the age of, I think it was 37, 38 or something like that, I realized that if I wasn't going to let something in me die, I was never going to grow. You don't have to worry about how that came to me. And so I thought, okay, I'm very afraid of death. I'm very afraid of lack of control. Therefore, I'm afraid of flying. So I'll go and learn to fly. And that every time I got into that little tin can in Louisville, Kentucky, or the New Mexico desert, which is where this happened for me, I was living there at the time, I was convinced I was going to die. And look, I looked at the accident stats. I mean, I could have died, I had no clue what I was doing. Things sometimes just fell out of the air. And every time I got into that plane, I was looking death in the face. And that was the most transformative thing that ever happened to me, because by the time I got into that plane by myself and flew solo without somebody who could take the controls if it all went wrong, I had learned to look death in the face, and I was prepared to change and to grow and to become something different. Now, when I had lymphoma, 3 years ago, which is a very aggressive form of lymphoma. It was during the pandemic. That was great, as you can imagine. Nevertheless, here I am. That was a similar thing. That was also looking death in the face. And that was really interesting to me, because I hadn't thought that I needed another transformation, but I did. And I needed to let a lot of old stuff go, even at that time of my life where I thought I had a few things sorted, then it always comes to hit you in the face and tell you that you haven't. And that was also looking death in the face, and the ability to say, okay, I might die here, and soon. What matters to me? What matters to me? What can I not live without? What can I not let go of? Everything else faded away. So I think, actually, Karen, I think all transformation involves a death, whether it's a kind of really outer kind of looking kind of death, or something that is a little bit more internal that nobody can really see happening. It's an ability which our culture lacks to tolerate the idea of death, and to be able to take it by the hand and walk with it through the rest of your life.
Yes. I think that, I think sometimes with life is, it's a preparation in my mind for death, and in some ways, and that if we can practice it and practice being graceful and courageous, as you've described, in the face of those little deaths, then what a wonderful thing to be able to leave this body and this particular form in a way that is with gratitude and grace. Oh,
Indeed. And in those old stories, death is the ultimate transformation, but it's never an ending. Not in the old stories. Never an
yeah,
ending.
yeah. So I want to bring it. So Henry asks, do the women sometimes represent the divine world via the natural?
In most European cultures, but I know my own best. So in Britain and in Irish mythology, yes, women represent the natural world, but they also, and particularly the land, they're kind of immanent in the land. But in our tradition, the other world is absolutely entangled with the land and a part of it. It's not somewhere separate. The other world is not a separate place like heaven might be for some people. It's absolutely entangled with the land. And it's kind of a different way of seeing. So all of a sudden, you kind of shake your head one day and you look and you know what you thought was a sea is actually a hill, or what you thought was a meadow of flowers is actually something in the other world. It's kind of piercing through the veil. So women in our tradition represented the other world entangled with the land, if that makes sense. So they were the moral authority of the other world and effectively told humans how to live in balance and harmony with it in a way that was good for everyone. Interestingly, in those old stories, whereas that is the role of women, the men, and yes, this is very binary, that's the way it was in those days, the men were very much more associated with cultural and social concepts like truth and justice and kind of discernment at the kind of social level about what was good and what was bad and what was wrong and what wouldn't fit.
How can we change form in a time of crisis? I'm thinking a little bit about the shape-shifting stories.
I do think it's very much about boundaries. I think it's very much about, as I was talking about, just not seeing us as separate, not seeing this skin as something that is hard. It's intensely porous. How many photons of light enter our eyes all the time? So I think it really is just a question of developing a sense of porosity. And if you're not separate for something, you're a part of it by definition. And then you're responsible for it, just as the way you're responsible for your own health and your own life. And I think to me, that sense of, it's all very easy to say we must all be connected. We must all feel connected to the natural world and take responsibility for it. But if you don't feel part of it, and I mean feel in a really embodied way, then that's just going to be so much intellectual stuff that it's very easy to put to one side. If your body really feels that you and the bluebell are not very different, then how can you possibly not care for it? How can you possibly not want to see it thrive?
Yeah. And it's related to that. Morgan is asking, what do you suggest in terms of practices for people who are unfamiliar with connecting to the natural world in a way that opens dialogue between human and natural world? So I know you were getting to this a little bit earlier, and I also really appreciated this the Enchanted Life, because it really gets into just the concrete practices that people can follow. I just wonder for you, what comes to mind, given the work you've been doing recently?
I'd say it's pretty much what I said before. I don't think I have anything that's very much more complicated than that. So one of my kind of early practices used to be, I'd go and I'd sing, or I'd tell a poem or even a story to a particular place. That was my way of honoring it and trying to give something. I kept thinking to myself, okay, as a human, what on earth does this place need from me other than just some kind of respect for it? And I thought, well, maybe it would like to hear me. It likes to hear birds. It likes to hear other creatures out there. Maybe it would like to hear me. And particularly in Scotland, where I knew I could speak a little bit of Scottish Gaelic and knew a couple of songs in Gaelic, I would just sit there by a place and sing to it. And I'll never forget one of the retreats I did, a very, very early retreat about this kind of stuff. And a woman came kind of by accident. She thought it was a writing workshop, and it wasn't. It was about this kind of connection. And I told them all to go out and talk to something and see what happened. Talk to something. She went and she sat by the sea, and she thought this was ridiculous. She didn't know what on earth it was for, but she was trying to be good and do the thing. And so she told the sea about a dog that had died when she was very young. And she came back and said, it wasn't necessarily that I thought that the sea had actively listened to me, but by the time I told the story, I didn't feel that we were separate anymore. And I thought, that's all That's all I wanted to happen there. And I really do believe that these simple, simple, simple things, everybody is looking for the complicated often, clearly not people here because we've all been looking at these things for a long time. But so often people are looking for a complicated fix. And it is as simple as sitting down and being and remembering who we are and who we were.
Yes, yes. And one thing I've really loved that you've said before is for those places that are neglected, places that maybe are not beautiful on the surface. Sometimes the urban places, blighted places, need love as much as the beautiful. So, as in our season right now, we have leaf peeping. People are coming into New England to see the beautiful change of colors, but also in the pigeons in the city. They're there, they're beings. And I've always really loved that about just where your feet are planted, learning to love those places because they need us. The whole idea that they need us as much as we need them.
I think so. And what's interesting is, I've lived in some wild and beautiful places for the past 20 years of my life, but it wasn't always so. I was brought up in an industrial zone in the northeast of England. It was a town that was known for, chemical works, chicken processing factories, sugar works, steel works. And it was by the sea. So on the one hand, you looked out to beautiful dune-covered beaches. You turned around and you could see all of these chimneys spewing with, chemicals and goodness knows what. But what was interesting as a child is that captured my imagination. So there was a particular contraption in one of these industrial estates that looked like a pitchfork. An enormous pitchfork. And so I would make up all of these stories about little devils who lived over there in the industrial zone. And it really still captured my imagination. And I think without that, my imagination wouldn't really be fully formed, because then it's important, as you say, to be able to take in the things that don't at first appear to be beautiful, because we have the world that we've got. Okay, we all want to change it for the better, but we have the world that we've got, and the world that we've got needs our attention. If you look back at the old Greek philosophy, which I have a lot of time for, and the concept of the anima mundi, the soul of the world, which imbues everything with soul and is its animacy, it always seems to me that if we refuse to engage with a place, we're refusing the soul of the world. We're refusing to be in relationship with it. And I believe that relationship is the essence of life and thriving. And so, yes, I think we have to learn, even if we don't want to be in a place forever, even if there are places that we think are more beautiful, we have absolutely to respect the place that we live for as long as we are there, because it is effectively giving us life, and it's alive. And would you reject a crying baby? You wouldn't. And so the world, those places need us too. Lots. I'll try and be polite and brief. I do think it's absolute nonsense. I mean, really, we live in a culture which thinks that imagination is in our heads. That it is something that we can divorce ourselves from everything, and we will still have the imagination to make the world beautiful and better and interesting and fascinating for us. But in my traditions and in my practice, imagination is nothing if it's not grounded. And I think we forget that very often, that whole idea that we can live in our heads, we can close ourselves off from the physical world, and we can live in our heads. Where do we think this stuff comes from that constitutes our imagination? It is all from the physical world. And I do not believe that if anybody is engaging in these acts of kind of, technological imagination, whatever it might be, virtual reality or whatever it's morphing into, that if they're not in some way deriving their imagination from the real world, then well, apart from the fact that it's just not real, it serves no purpose. I don't know what the purpose of imagination for imagination's sake is, if it's not to create a stronger sense of belongingness to the world around us. And most of these techniques seem to do the opposite. They alienate us from the world around us. So I think it's the wrong direction. And I think it is a direction taken by people who don't understand that it is much more exciting out there in the real world if you employ your imagination and you're in a relationship. Much more interesting, infinitely more interesting to me. And so really, I think that all of us who understand that, the way to fight it is really to show people that there is something better on the other side, really, isn't it? I would say.
Do you think there are dangerous or malignant forces doing harm in the world, thereby instances where protective boundaries are necessary due to our porousness? How can we relate with darker energies? Great question.
It is a very good question. I mean, I think the way that we do in the physical world, if I can make that distinction for the purpose of trying to make a coherent answer, where, we do protect ourselves. If women particularly have learned to protect ourselves, but men too, in many situations, that we don't just blunder in out there in the dark and assume it'll all be all right, because we know it won't be. And so for me, I think there has to be an acknowledgement of the darker aspects of life as well as the lighter aspects of life. And I do think that in our culture today, we have a particularly negative way of being, which is to focus on the love and light. Just focus on the love and light. Love and light can do anything. Well, it can do a lot, but we have to recognize, yes, that there are other energies out there. There are other emotions out there. There are other forces out there, depending on what your particular belief system is. So I would say that whenever you are going out into the world and in this kind of, and putting your imagination out there as well as your physical body and kind of reaching out, then yes, you have to be very careful and very cautious. And I think that's natural. In the world, there is dark and there is light. And I think the trick is to understand it and to watch for it and to feel, to do whatever it is that makes you feel safe. I have a great imaginal wolf. I have a really great imaginal wolf who's been with me since I was a very, very small child. And whenever I do something that I'm not entirely comfortable about or I'm not sure about, that wolf will eat anything that comes to get me. And I believe that firmly. And all I need to do is believe it firmly for it to be true. And I think we can all find our own sense of, what is protective, to make sure that we're not too frightened to push, but we do feel safe. Yeah. Good question.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah. And you've spoken about the wrath of particularly of older women, and if you, I don't know if you want to bring in an example from a story of that kind of energy that ultimately serves life, but through perhaps destruction. And then there's the Voices of the Wells story too.
Yeah. All of the best goddesses, particularly, and I'm saying this because I don't know stories of gods. I've very much focused on women's stories. All of the best of them are very ambiguous. They're neither one thing nor the other. It depends on how you approach them. The best character of all, in this respect, is from the Slavic traditions, Baba Yaga. I'm sure some of you know Baba Yaga, but I'm constantly surprised by how many people don't. So Baba Yaga is the old woman, the solitary old woman in the dark woods who has a house that is set on chicken legs, and so it runs away sometimes, and you might not find it in the same place. And she flies through the air in a mortar with a pestle to kind of get her through the air. And she clearly, I don't need to tell you why, but she clearly once was a Slavic goddess. There is no question about it. All of the motifs and images and characters around her make it very clear. But if you go looking for her help, you might get it, or you might get put into her man-sized oven in her kitchen and get roasted and eaten. And it's all about your approach and whether you're prepared to be respectful, whether you're prepared to do the hard work, because hard work is such a big part of these stories, and to just kind of listen and learn. And then if you do that, then that's terrific. Off you go. But she's not bad because she roasts people. Back in the good old days, that would have been a sign of that's life. Sometimes you live, sometimes you die, and sometimes you die because you've messed up. Not always, clearly, but sometimes you do. And here's how to make sure that that you have a little bit more success in the world. So I think that ambiguity, where not everybody is nice, for older women, life, nice is not always a life goal, and that's fine. Doesn't mean say you have to be mean to everybody, but it's just like, okay, there are more important things here. And I think for someone who has had it instilled in her as a child, you must be good, you must be nice, you must be good. I'm really glad that that's over. And the best old stories have consequences, and the consequences are if your heart is in the wrong place, if you don't care enough, if you're not courteous enough, then bad stuff happens. And I think in some sense, these stories help us to to really kind of focus on the qualities that are going to serve the world and to try to do away with the qualities that are not. And of course, they're fairy tales and they're very drastic and everything is exaggerated, but they do have nevertheless some kind of wisdom there. So yeah, as I get older, I think I'm starting to think about those very complicated old stories and those boundaries of consequences and not consequences and what's reasonable.
Thank you. Thank you. One of the things that I've really loved learning about is the fairy tales or the stories that the kind of similar elements that happen across cultures and across time frames. And how can you connect with place and find the stories of place if you don't speak the language? He says, I'm a Brit who moves a lot now in the Netherlands, and the language is a barrier. Any tips would be appreciated.
I don't know so much about language. Okay, I'm not sure I can answer that. I mean, other than read stuff. I mean, I'd be just facetious, like read it in translation or learn the language. And I don't mean to be facetious, but I think to me, it's less about language than it is about connection again. Everywhere around the world, I did a course with a woman called Pat McCabe, whose name in the Lakota tradition is Woman Stand Shining. I don't know whether any of you might be familiar with her, but she and I did a course together where she was presenting her people's idea of the world and women in it, and I was presenting my people's idea of the world and women in it, and it was identical. It was just everybody wore different clothes, but the same principles, women, land, balance, harmony, consequences were very much there in both of our very geographically wide traditions. And I think you'll find wherever you go, if you know that in your tradition there is an old woman who created and shaped the land, you'll find an old woman archetype in the land wherever you go. So my old woman, the Kalia, who is very much associated with wild, windy places, rain, storms, absolutely imminent in the land of this part of the world. You're not going to find her in the New Mexico desert, but you'll find an old woman there for sure. And I think that that knowledge of our ancestral stories, the stories from the places where we are from, help us identify the stories in other places, if that makes sense, because they're not going to be very different. They're going to have the same archetypes. They're going to have the same themes. They're going to have very similar images. It's just that their characters might wear different clothes and eat different food.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm so glad you brought this up because I wanted to make sure we talked about this topic of developing or discovering or rediscovering one's own indigeneity, and which, because I think we think, okay, well, indigenous peoples are, if for me, for example, I'm a Western white woman, so and that those indigenous perspectives are for someone else. They're Native American or Mayan, etc. And you have been really empowering in, I think, encouraging people to learn about your own traditions. They exist, even if they're buried under centuries of colonization. So if you could just speak to a little bit to that and that process, and why you think that's important.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say that there was a French philosopher called René Guénon, and he once suggested that, I can't remember, a century ago perhaps, we live in degenerate times, at the end of a long age during which the wisdom that we once had and important spiritual truths have been lost. Ancient centers of wisdom have been destroyed and the guardians of that wisdom have been dispersed. But he said, in folklore and myths and fairy tales, there is a repository for that wisdom. And these stories are told and told and told so that someday, somebody who can unpick the wisdom stored in those stories will come along and it will be allowed into the world again. So I'm a firm believer in that stories really do contain that kind of wisdom. And I think for me, it is very much about understanding that for those of us whose ancestry is in Europe, we were indigenous. Some of us still are, in certain parts of Europe where there really hasn't been very much movement. And these old stories from our lineage, from our tradition, are exactly the same kinds of stories that you will find in indigenous cultures all over the world. And the most powerful example of that for me is the story that you mentioned a while ago, Karen, that I wrote about in If Women Are As Rooted, which is an old story from the Celtic traditions, which is, and I won't bore you with all of the places where it comes from, but basically says that there were otherworldly maidens who came out of wells, out of sacred wells in the land. This is in England, okay, who everybody thinks has no tradition, came out of the wells in the land of England. And at that time, it was believed that wells had their source in the other world. And whenever any traveler passed by, they would come out of the wells and they would offer that traveler, if they were in need, they'd offer them a drink from their golden grails, clue, and they'd offer them food from a golden platter if they wanted that, and then the travelers would go on their way. And this is the way the story says that the other world served the land. And everybody respected the wells, everybody respected the well maidens, everything was fine until a king came along whose name was Ammon, and this king did not respect the ways of the land or anything else very much. And so he was riding past one day and he saw a beautiful well maiden with her golden grail, thought that was very fine, took her golden grail, threw it to one side, took the well maiden, put her over the side of the well and raped her. And at that point, all of his men thought, this is great. So off they went around the country, raping all of the other well maidens. Not surprisingly, the well maidens went back into the wells, back into the other world, didn't come out again, and the land became a wasteland. And that is the original wasteland story. It was because the women were disrespected, and it was because the gifts and the nourishment that were freely given, nothing in return other than respect, freely given from the other world, were disrespected. Wasteland, gone. And that is such a powerful story. And I defy you again, to find a better one in any tradition that shows us how important it is to respect not just the feminine, but certainly the feminine. Isn't that interesting? But the world and the gifts of the world, the gifts that are given to us so freely. And if we don't, wasteland. And I think, as I wrote in If Women Are As Rooted, for many of us, we feel as if we're living in a wasteland. But the way out of it is back to that respect, connection, relationship, I think.
Oh, what a beautiful, beautiful place to end. And I think, I have in my mind a story that you've told. I've heard you tell quite a bit about, it's the question of what ails thee. And so I just want to, I don't know if you have one more minute to talk about the idea of because I see, we see all these human beings trying to solve things. And we talk a lot about, we cannot solve this crisis with the same consciousness that created it. And that story of that hopefully you'll tell about what ails thee. It's a different way of approaching the problems that we face.
Yes, and I think that my focus on that story stems from my deep discomfort with the hero's journey, which is a very, today anyway, whether that was what Joseph Campbell meant, today it's very much an individualist kind of swashbuckling, kind of overcoming everything for glory journey. And that's not what really I think we should be doing right now. Campbell always argued that the old Grail stories were heroic, that it was all about the knight who went out in search of the Holy Grail, that it was his heroic quest to gain the Grail and the glory. But what is very interesting is that in many of the old stories about the knight, who is normally called Percival, but sometimes is Galahad, but normally is Percival, who goes out looking for the Grail. He doesn't know that that's what he's doing, but it turns out that he is. He never knew it. He never knew it. When he first comes across the Grail castle and the wounded Fisher King, who, as a consequence of whose wound the land has become a wasteland, he doesn't ask any questions. He just gets on, he eats his dinner, he goes to bed, gets up the next morning, and not surprisingly, it's all gone. After he has grown a bit with the help of a very wonderful old lady called Kundry in the very best story, after he has grown a bit and finds the Grail castle again, he understands what will attain the Grail for him. The way that he becomes the keeper of the Grail King, is not by all of the battles that he has fought along the way or by any dragons whose heads he's cut off. It is by going to that Fisher King, the wounded Fisher King, and saying, what ails thee? So that's the vast heroic journey. It's not about glory. It is about simple compassion. And that's what I call a post-heroic journey. And that's a whole other story that I don't have time to go into. But that sense of what the journey was about in our oldest stories was always about compassion and relationality. It was never about cutting the heads off dragons or killing people in battle. That's what gained you the grail. And the grail in the oldest traditions was that life-giving nourishment, that the beauty of the other world given to this land, to us in this land.
So, thank you. May we all humans learn how to ask the right questions, and I think learn from your scholarship and your heart and your deep knowing of these stories that have, I know personally, it's meant so much to me. Sharon, thank you so much. We've had a really rich chat, so I've asked Fru to save it so that you can look at it later, because there's been some really amazing comments and wisdom shared by the audience. So thank you everyone for coming. We will be at the Garrison Institute continuing this conversation with a range of people from all different perspectives in New York City, as I said, on November 9th. And Sharon, who's busy writing right now, will hopefully be doing a virtual program at the Institute sometime in 2024 or beyond, whenever we can work it out. Sharon, we just love having you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. A real pleasure.